Time. There's time enough at last.
Hello everyone, my name is Kevin and this is the Wasteland Survivor channel. On this channel, I'm talking everything sci-fi, robots, lasers, and you guessed it, wastelands. If you're a sci-fi lover, wasteland survivor, or an aspiring author, you're on the right channel. So let's strap in. In this episode, I'm talking about one of my favorite sci-fi shows of all time, The Twilight Zone. It's where some of my greatest inspirations have come from. Of all the fantastic and amazing episodes that I could possibly go over, and there are many, I choose my number one overall favorite to start this channel. It comes from episode 8 in season 1. The episode I'm talking about is Time Enough at Last. So Time Enough at Last follows bank teller Henry Bemis, who just doesn't really pay much attention to the people around him because he's too busy reading. He cares so much about reading that he even bothers a poor customer to tell her about David Copperfield. In the process, he doesn't give her the right change, and she mentions that this has been an ongoing issue. Then his boss is ticked because he's not paying attention to his job and instead is reading. His wife similarly hates his passion for reading so much, even asking her to read poetry from a book when she scribbled out the words. The next day he goes on lunch, and he goes down into the bank vault so that he can read his newspaper and several other books that he's taken with him. He decides he wants to go into the bank vault to read in peace, as I know we all do. He reads about the H-bomb fears in a newspaper and how that would lead to world-ending destruction. And wouldn't you know it, that exact thing happens very soon after. For those of you too young to know, the H-bomb was essentially the second-generation atom bomb or nuclear bomb. Henry Bemis is knocked unconscious by the blast. When he wakes up later, he goes upstairs to see the whole city around him, and most likely the civilized world has been destroyed. He's the only man for miles around, and he sort of walks around aimlessly for a time, trying to see if anyone's alive or if anything is working. He even goes back to his old house. There is that little part of him, as I'm sure would be a part of all of us, where you want to try and see if your home is still standing after a basically nuclear war happens. After finding canned food and some cigarettes and essentially nothing else, he finds a revolver in an old sporting goods store, or rather the remains of a sporting goods store. As he decides and contemplates whether to end his own life and whether anyone would even know that he committed suicide, he actually spots the public library right in front of him. It's still in decent shape, and then as he's counting the books, he sees that there's plenty for him to read, probably for the rest of his life. It's at this point you see that his hope for humanity or survival is very much tied with his obsession to reading. He piles up the books into months, where he has January over here, February over there, March, April, and so on. He suddenly relishes the opportunity to read all of the books and all of the things he could possibly want to without anyone ever bothering him. As he bends down to pick up a book that had fallen, he sort of stumbles and his glasses fall off his face. And when he picks them up, he realizes that the lenses themselves have shattered. As the camera pans out away from him, stuck in a forever limbo, unable to read, unable to see, he just simply laments.
That's not fair. That's not fair at all. There was time now.
And that's essentially where the episode ends. Burgess Meredith makes one of several appearances in The Twilight Zone. If you don't know who Burgess Meredith is, he was the coach in Rocky 1. And Burgess does a bang-up job in one of his best performances. He's been in several episodes, as I mentioned, but in my opinion, this is his best overall. Because this really is a hard scene, a hard bunch of scenes to have to basically do on your own and have to actually emote to the viewer all of the different feelings without overdoing it and without underdoing it, right? Like, for the most part, if you're by yourself, you're not talking out loud to yourself and saying, that's not fair, or wow, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? You're pretty much going to be thinking that. So for him to say it out loud and for him to be able to show the viewer how he feels without overdoing it, I think it's a masterclass in being able to perform on your own. What really hits me as a sci-fi lover is just the stark loneliness of this episode. The background behind me is actually what he sees when he first comes up out of the bank vault. Bemis goes from a man who just wants to be left alone with his books, to then a man lonely for company and ready to die, and then finally, a man who remembers his obsession and suddenly all is right with the world for him. This episode really essentially only features 4 characters: Henry Bemis, his boss, his wife, and the customer at the very beginning of the episode. The latter three are really, they serve to show some of his personality traits and to kind of be foils for him. And in such a short time, I think he shows very quickly that he's a naive, innocent, but also selfish person. He's beset by society, but also shirks it. He's both a victim and a victimizer, if you can call him that, in the sense that when the customer gets her change wrong, he didn't victimize her in some violent way, but she becomes sort of a victim of his obsession and his naivety. And then his wife is also sidelined in favor of his books and his obsession with reading literally anything nearby. Yet, she's not really shown as too sympathetic because she's so vindictive. I think part of it's sort of a commentary on classic literature being eschewed, but I also believe that the writing was meant to show Bemis as a poor victim, and like I said, at the same time, a victimizer. Yet what I find interesting is the only two times he really cries or seems upset is when he realizes he's alone and when his glasses break, which I also want to go into about his glasses. So they show his glasses a few times in the story and in the episode. There are a couple of times where actually his glasses fall off. There's a foreshadowing when him and his wife are supposed to go play cards with their neighbors. Yet the thing that I found so interesting is the only two times he really shows that he's upset or that he has sad emotions is when his glasses break and when he realizes that he's alone. He doesn't mourn his wife in any real tangible way other than going back home. And it starts to feel like it's like the world revolves around Henry Bemis. And when it doesn't, he can't understand why. There is no way that he's ever going to find his way in the world. Now that he has no one around and there's no one to repair his glasses for him or even guide him to any place other than where he is standing, he's basically left to die. Although you don't really know if he's going to die or maybe he's going to get back to his canned food. He might have some way to survive, but in a very, very limited fashion. But I took it to mean more that he was doomed. So one of the things I did want to focus on too is even though, and I'm going to get to my writing in a second, but even though it's a show, I thought that there were some things that were very interesting about the way that the information is presented to you. For example, Henry Bemis is shown to be, like I said, naive, selfish, also innocent in some ways. And you're meant to kind of treat him as the victim, mainly because of the way that the other characters are presented. For example, the boss is very, hard-nosed, very serious all the time. He also seems to, as Henry goes to read a magazine right near his boss's door, he kind of him, come on, move along. Because he had just basically told him, if you don't shape up, you get to ship out. The same thing with his wife. His wife is dressed in very dark colors, basically black. I know it's black and white, but it looks like she's even dressed in black with a little bit of white. Her hair is black, her features are hard, and it's meant to show that Henry is the victim in his own world. But at the same time, these people also have a point. I mean, it talks a lot about obsession. His obsession is reading, which I think is very interesting because it's sort of a PG, readily accessible obsession. You can kind of insert any obsession or addiction for his reading. But I thought that it was interesting because his reading in and of itself is very innocuous, but at the same time, it's getting in the way of his real life. So in talking about my writing, I strive to create characters that are complex and engaging, and ones that you might even feel akin to. But I also try to write characters where maybe the readers might say at some point throughout the novel or at some point in the storyline, this is where I leave you. This is where I can no longer support what you're doing. Dr. Amelia Wong, for example, is one such character, one that I intentionally wrote in a way where I was hoping, and I still do hope now, that people will have this conversation about at what point does she really lose herself in the situation. Without going into it too much and spoiling too much about the novel, she has to go through more and more fascistic ways of keeping her society intact because there are threats within and now threats without. When the Annexers Alliance shows up and they're at their doorstep, or maybe not at their actual doorstep, but they're trying to get in to their underground community, Dr. Wong has to resort to more and more oversight and more ways to keep people safe, but at the same time, she's taking away their rights. And the question that I had for the reader is, at what point do you think that she went too far? And is there a point that she went too far? There may be some people, and this is totally up for discussion. I hope that it is up for discussion. There's some people that might say, Dr. Wong actually, all the way through, I agree with her, even on principle, even if some of the things she was actually doing were invasive or taking people's rights away, I understood exactly why she was doing it. And at the same time, there might be other people who, as soon as she starts to go through those fascistic ways, they might say, you know what, that's too much for me. So the reason that I'm starting with this channel is because of the profound effect that this episode in particular had on me as a sci-fi lover, a wasteland lover, someone who just always has consumed that kind of content. And I thought that this channel would be a good way to connect with you and to be able to discuss some sci-fi that you love, and also maybe to discuss why you would hopefully like or want to pick up my series and read it as well. So the reason that I love this episode is because of the wasteland itself and the character Henry Bemis. They're both so drearily compelling that I just can't stop watching it, even though it looks just like a horrid place to live. It remains with me long after I watch that episode. In fact, Rod Serling, the creator of the Twilight Zone, who did many, many episodes, which I do hope to get into more as I do this channel. My whole series, actually, my series name comes from this very episode. And I want to go over a couple of things to illustrate the point. So, with my book series, the book is book 1 called The Vital Link, and the series is A Spark in the Ashes. And one of the things I do want to show that maybe people skip over and don't really concentrate too much on is what's called an epigraph. So an epigraph is basically a short saying, a short quote from a piece of literature that really sticks with the author that they want to include as sort of like a thematic presentation for the reader. It could also be that the writer just enjoyed that quote and wanted to just share it with you, but more often than not, I find that the epigraph has something to do with the actual book that you're about to read. So the epigraph that I chose to put in my novel, and what I'm thinking is going to be the whole series because it really does stick with me, is actually a quote from this episode. And I think it really encapsulates exactly how I feel about writing this dystopian sci-fi that I really want to work on. So the epigraph reads, "Seconds, minutes, hours, they crawl by on hands and knees for Mr. Henry Bemis, who looks for a spark in the ashes of a dead world." And that's where my epigraph is. Usually it goes right after the dedication page. This is the dedication to my wife and my kids. And this is the epigraph that I think really encapsulates my love of sci-fi, wastelands, and dystopian settings, which I want to get into more dystopian type settings in future episodes. So, what's your favorite part of this episode? Did you enjoy it as much as I did? And while you're at it, check out my novel series, A Spark in the Ashes, in all major and minor outlets. And be sure to keep an eye out for novel 2. If you see Mr. Bemis in your travels, give him a hand. He surely needs it.